This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft. Because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story. Hello and welcome to this week's Storyworks Roundtable. Today, Robert and I are so excited because Kathryn is back. Hello, Kathryn.
Party!
That's right, it's a party now. We are going to talk about motivation, what motivates your character, why it is so important, and why your reader needs to understand this, even if it's just subconsciously. We have to be on board with that protagonist motivation to keep drawing us through the story deeper and deeper into the conflict. So, problems with motivation, do you guys struggle with that?
Yeah, I think it's hard. You sort of feel like you're articulating something that you don't necessarily know about your character. When certainly in first draft, you might have I might have an overall goal. I know what the character wants, what they're trying to achieve in the story. But I think sometimes that deep down of they're doing this because or there's that unknown motivation that maybe the character themselves doesn't know either, because it's part of what shaped them in their lives. So
right.
I suppose, and I don't do character interviews. I know some people say that's helpful. I've not done that, and so maybe that's a great way to extract it too. So I often do find that it's in revision. I can be quite a sort of mechanical plot writer to start, and then my revisions often flesh out more about the character, which is kind of interesting. So I do struggle a bit with motivation sometimes.
Yeah, I think that's common for people to discover, use the first draft as a discovery draft, and then to revise and layer things in. Kathryn, do you struggle with motivation?
I think that it would be wrong to say no. I think that it's one of those things that you feel like you kind of get a grasp on it, and then there's like 7 more layers that you just keep going down. Listening to you guys, I think you were talking to Emma about like when in your narrative drive episode, you're talking about that. The idea of like in the conflict, what would your character do and why, and I think you were talking about this in terms of like what the car and the dog and like, I don't remember
Yes.
exactly.
Yes.
But that actually struck a real chord with me in terms of like finding motivation was to like really say, not what would I do in this situation, but what would my character do in this situation?
Yes.
And so I actually took a scene that I was working on, and here's my lovely journal. There's like 4 pages of notes in which I just tried to kind of play that game, like she was talking about, like, the 9 options of what your character might do. And then as you go, you realize it's not what I would do. This is what I would do. That's the first thing that comes into your mind. This is what I would do. And then you're like, oh, wait, well, maybe my character, their emotional state is a little different than I would be in that situation. So here's another option. Here's the third option or whatever. I ended up writing like 12 options, and all of them were viable for my character. And I was like, whoa. Like, you don't realize there are that many options sometimes. And so it's interesting because I feel like I got a very much better idea of what my character's actual motivation in that scene was, because I evaluated kind of her emotional state and what was going on in her life at the time, and she would have been with the other character that was pivotal in that scene, like what was going on in their relationship, and what would that do to her motivation. She's gonna do something different because he's there versus if she was alone, like all these different factors that popped in that I hadn't even thought about before because I hadn't dug down that deep. So.
Yes. Yeah, and what you're describing is like the agency tree exercise and worksheet in my character book, where you have to just go through and censor nothing and come up with all those possible options, and then you pick the option or combination of options that's best for your story. So you're factoring in all these things you were just kind of talking about, like her emotional state and whether or not someone else is present and everything. But you also have to think, as the puppet master here, what advances the story best toward the next movement in the plot, and what's going to be the most gripping to the reader.
what makes it the most complicated, or the most interesting in terms of the conflict that's going on, because I already knew the conflict and I knew the outcome that I wanted to have happen,
right?
And like I said, any of those options would have worked, but each of them were a slight different nuance on her motivation, which then made it more interesting to get to that end result,
right?
Which was fun.
Yeah, and writers get into trouble sometimes when they're thinking about the end result, about the plot point that they need to get to next, and then they're trying to shoehorn the character into the plot. And so the other piece of this that makes motivation so critical is that it has to be organic to your character, to that like deep psychological driving force. What is compelling the character to make this choice over that choice in this set of circumstances. And especially when we get closer to the climax and deeper into the plot, things are harder, stakes are greater. So why not just walk away? And if your reader doesn't buy your character's motivation, that's that driving force, then your character becomes unbelievable and your story becomes, disposable. It's no longer a viable, exciting narrative for your reader.
That's true. Yeah, it becomes contrived, doesn't it?
Right.
And that can be very simple, such as, I'm going to pick up the phone and call them now, and you think, well, hang on, they've never exhibited that type of behavior in the rest of the book, and why is that happening now? And it's only happened because the authors needed to get to a certain point. So there's a consistency of motivation, I think, that's important too. And I guess this is, whether people fall on either end of that extreme of, pantsing or plotting, you'll regularly hear authors say, well, I felt the characters sort of took me in this direction. And I suppose what they're really saying is I started to understand the character's motivation in a different way.
Exactly.
And it gave me another path. And whether that be conscious or unconscious, because personally, I'd have this view of when people say, "Oh, the characters started talking to me and doing this," I just think it's a load of BS. Personally,
right?
It's like, well, you're the author, so if we've all got voices talking to us in our heads. That's why we write. But I think if we look at it as another layer of motivation coming through, then that's helpful.
Right.
I think that this is part of the reason sometimes in the beginnings of the books, they're the hardest for the motivations. Like once you get to know your character a little bit, they start taking off a little bit. You start understanding a little bit more about why they're doing what they're doing. I think this is another thing that really, for me, if I don't get the motivation within the first couple chapters of a book, I'm done reading it. Like I just...
Yes.
Yes.
And so I think this is another thing that, a lot of times we have to, as writers, we work into. And then we need to go back and work it back into. Or get rid of those chapters a lot of those times. We talk about the chapters that are throwaway at the beginning that you're just trying to figure stuff out.
Yes, or do a lot of pre-writing. Do your developmental generative writing first with the journal. I was just teaching, just on Friday, I finished teaching my class in the prison here. And so that was 10 weeks on character. And it was very interesting watching the students sort of discover things about their characters as I made them do all the pre-writing developmental work that, who knows? It's so easy to read a book and go, oh yeah, that's a great exercise, and then never actually do it. And I found as we worked through everything together that motivation was something kind of hard to imagine in the pre-writing stages, but the deeper they got, and by the time they were at the end of the semester working on the character arc, that motivation was really factoring into all of their choices, because you don't develop your character in a bubble and then develop your plot in a bubble. You really have to do them largely together, so you see how one thing shapes another, and the plot will help shape the character as much as that character worldview and motivation shapes the choices we make going through the plot.
Right.
You
can't just say, they did it because I had to have them do it.
Well, that's when the writer's hand becomes apparent to the reader. That's Deus Ex Machina. It's where you're like,
Right.
oh, you just had your protagonist do this so that you could get us over there. Yeah, okay, whatever. And that becomes, it just feels phony to us as readers.
Yep.
Well, that whole idea of being out of character, I suppose, that's really what we're saying, isn't it? When they did something out of character, it means they did something that didn't line up with the motivation they've been exhibiting all along.
Right.
How do you think about and plan for, if that's the right word, motivation over a series? So where there's maybe the character arc varies because maybe they have a big arc in, say, book 1, book 2 is more, it could be flat or negative if it's a trilogy.
Right.
Maybe where there's that sort of 3 acts staged over the 3 books.
Right.
Do you ever really step back and think about that motivation in that way? And
yeah, you have to.
What advice would you have?
You have to. So you need to look at the series arc as this large overarching umbrella, and then each book is a portion of that arc. So we'll see the character's progress over each book, but we aren't going to reach the culmination of, that final transformation until the end of the series. So I'm going to go back to my standbys because I'm so familiar with them. In Harry Potter, at the beginning, he's the orphan. What he wants is a family. So our motivation, I call it your layer cake with 3 layers. There's the surface motivation that's very plot-driven. Get the girl, save the world type stuff.
Yeah.
And then there's your psychological motivation that your character is going to understand if he's somewhat introspective, has some awareness or some realizations over the course of the stories. And then there's that deep psychological driver that the writer has to understand. A very astute reader will probably pick up on it. Your character may or may not ever pick up on it.
Yeah.
So at the end of book 7, we have that critical epilogue where we see Harry as the father and the husband. So he's gone from the orphan boy without a family to the father, patriarch, protector, provider with his own family. So that's the culmination of the series arc. And along the way, various father figures come and go from his life, like Dumbledore and Sirius Black. And right. So we see that theme of being a boy without a father, needing a male role model play out multiple times over the series, each time becoming deeper, more mature, darker, like with Sirius getting pulled into that black hole, witnessing Dumbledore's death. His own father comes up in the Patronus, right? So that's a great example of having one through line for your series character arc. What's motivating him?
Yeah.
His deep driving force is a need for a father figure, for that protector and role model and provider.
Okay, so you just reminded me that it's something I've heard talked about before in the way of separating out in between wants and needs. So there's the things that the character wants, which are usually much more easy for the character to consciously articulate, whether they be plot mechanical or a better life. Right. But then there's the underlying drivers, which are what they really need, which they may be completely unaware of, as you say. Harry's not necessarily, when he's young, when he's 11 and going to wizard school, thinking, I need a family, but cleverly, J.K. Rowling has made that a driver of the entire series. Okay, so
right.
So would you say then, if you're planning a series, it's worth then thinking that through prior to even beginning book 1?
Absolutely, yeah. I think you need to maybe not have. You don't necessarily need to have it set in stone, but you need to have a handle on it because it's going to shape so much of your story. So knowing what your character's deep psychological wound is, Harry's parents were murdered when he was an infant. There you go. It's very obvious what that wound is. But knowing those deep wounds and what your character wants to fill that hole on different levels, that's going to help you shape the motivation, which shapes the choices, which keeps things organic, which keeps your readers buy-in as the plot gets tougher and we move deeper toward the climax.
Because the thing that I've found challenging at times is feeling very confident about that whole psychological aspect in book one, and feeling like I've really sealed something up for the character at the end of that book, and then I think, but I've got nowhere to go now because
right.
It's
well, that was
sorted.
Resolved.
Yes. That's right. So it's like peak too early.
Yeah, it's easy to do that. So that's another really great reason, if you're writing a series, to figure out what that issue is and to set markers for yourself, like, how can I keep playing out this issue? How can it evolve as my character evolves and as my story grows, so that I don't find myself written into a corner going, well, she's whole, she's healed, okay, now what?
Yeah, or if you have done that, then you don't jump the shark and have them, but not really.
Yeah, right.
However, that is sort of the way that humanity and the psyche works. So you think you've figured it out. Oh, I've arrived. And going back to Harry Potter, end of book one, he's found a family. He has Hermione and Ron's family and everything. He has to go back to the Dursleys, but he's looking forward to Hogwarts again because he belongs somewhere. But has he really solved that issue inside of himself? And the answer is no. There's more to it than that. But, at the end, I'm sure he felt like, hey, I belong somewhere. Character arc, kind of thing. But it's just one more, again, kind of like peeling it back. We've kind of fixed one aspect, quotes, of who we are. And that's going to open up whole different issues for the character.
Yes, well, and let's point out, too, that he found somewhere he belongs and has friends and family, but he hasn't found a replacement father.
Right.
Dumbledore is more distant through that book. As Harry gets older, he's more of a mentor. He gets closer to Harry, and Sirius Black is a major turning point where here's someone who's actually ready to, adopt him and become his new father. So The Onion, Kathryn, is a great metaphor for this, because, as you're thinking of your series arc and what this is, go, okay, what are the layers? Kind of like the agency tree exercise you were talking about, where you write down all the options for this plot point. How can my character react? What can she do now? You could do that for your character's fatal flaw and psychological driving force in that motivation, and say, okay, how many layers are there to this? How many ways can this manifest in my character's life? Because we might resolve one small aspect of it or think we have, but there's something deeper,
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep, there's more to it. And so the more ways it can manifest, the more material you have as a writer to play with through the book. So in one book, it's finding peers where he fits in. In another book, it's finding a mentor who, gives him affection. In another book, it's, going to Ron's family and getting the home knit sweater, or what, so there are all these different ways we can play with facets of that wound. Right. Yeah. But the wound's not going to be resolved.
Not your character.
Right. Till the very end. Yeah.
Yep.
That's excellent. Thank you.
Sure. What else? Other thoughts on character motivation?
Well, what about competing motivations? So, because that's often what makes the character flawed, for example, and can make a story really interesting. Where how can I say it? There are some stories where you just well, I knew they were going to do that, and so like as Kathryn says, you get up past 2 or 3 chapters, think, yeah, okay, right,
Right.
see where this is going. So there's something about us as readers that craves complexity in there. Is that a case of competing motivations, do you think? Is that where we get, I suppose if you're listing 9 or 10 different things, choices that a character could make in any one moment, you are essentially listing competing motivations. But it seems to me that that's what keeps the reader on their toes, and because you don't quite know how they're going to handle something.
Right. Well, I think we can take the motivation at its deepest level down to a single driving force, but we've all been touching on things like the flaw and the motivation and the reactions to plot, and we're seeing how all of these are intertwined. You can't really develop one without thinking about the others. So as you're bringing this up, Robert, what I'm thinking about is the example I used of a criminal attorney whose driving motivation is to save the world. He feels responsible for bringing down the bad guys and putting them behind bars, and that is his deep driving motivation. He also loves his family and wants to protect them, just like he wants to protect the world. He wants to keep them safe, and that's tied up with putting the bad guys behind bars. But because he takes all of this on himself, there's this fatal flaw. He feels solely responsible. He carries the world on his shoulders. He starts neglecting his family and putting all of his energy into work. And then the burden becomes too much, and he starts compensating with drinking. He's got to finish the workday and go drink to let go of the workday before he can go home, and this further destroys his family. So I'm wondering if that's kind of what you mean about competing motivations, that complexity of he wants both. He wants a happy, healthy family, and he wants to keep them safe, but he can't do both because that driving force has like pushed him too far to one thing. Right? Does that make sense? Is that kind of what you were talking about?
Yeah, so that gives us the internal conflict that then makes the story more interesting and not just plot driven. It makes it more character driven, because that the character is going to be faced with decisions that are not just plot dilemmas but also personal dilemmas for them. And I think when those two collide, that's when you get a really seriously good. And
there we've got, so say your main plot is work related. It's about the criminal case the guy is trying to put behind bars right now. But the subplot, here we're seeing that interconnectivity. The subplot is about the marriage falling apart and him losing touch with his children, and how that complicates what he's doing at work and makes him less effective as an attorney, when here he's facing this really big bad guy. So
good example of this I haven't read the books, but in TV, the Bosch series on Amazon Prime.
Yep. I've
very
watched
much
all of
exactly
those.
what you're talking. Oh my gosh, they're brilliant. But yeah, just that interweaving of his motivation, family, and work, and it immediately creates conflict that's fascinating, and you really want to know what he's going to do next because of that conflict, motivation-wise. So
Yeah, definitely. And you see how the driving force motivates both the personal and the professional choices, but because that force is so strong, and this is fiction, we need our characters to get into trouble, the personal and the professional clash, or the family and the duty. It doesn't always have to be a career choice, but A and B, they clash, they come into conflict with each other.
And the character has to make a choice, and that choice
is often the wrong choice.
Well,
Or, it's the right choice for the plot, the wrong choice for the subplot, further complications. We care about the family. Can we save the family and bring down the bad guy or whatever?
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. So, well, I guess we can wrap this up. Final thoughts or questions? All right. So just a reminder that your motivation is critical to the choices your character makes, how he reacts to various situations, to keeping your reader engaged and present in your story. And it's all intertwined. No element of your story stands alone. Thank you for listening to the Storyworks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.